Welcome to our very timely discussion today. I was just told to remind everyone that we are using the hashtag RussiaFactor. So if you would like to tweet about anything you hear, please do so with that hashtag. Again, this is a very timely discussion today. We have a high-level panel that will be able to provide context to recent events, such as the new Mueller indictment of the 12 GRU officials and the charges against Maria Butina that expose Russia's interference operations in our democracy, as well as Putin's comments at the Helsinki summit that equivocate our two judicial processes. We now know that GRU officers hacked into the Democratic Party in order to secure and release compromising information in the critical months leading up to the 2016 presidential election. That the Kremlin sought to influence our domestic politics by cultivating ties with the NRA. That it continues to wage cyber war against critical infrastructure and inject disinformation into the social media ecosystem. And we know that these activities mirror what the Kremlin has been doing in Europe for decades. Russia uses a multi-pronged and integrated toolkit, including a mix of disinformation, cyber capabilities, economic coercion, support for political and social groups, malign financial influence, and a sustained attack on our society and democratic institutions. Today, we will discuss how Russia employs these asymmetric tactics to exploit vulnerabilities in our judicial processes, media environment, and financial system, with a focus on what should be done to create resilience. We will also explore the internal dimensions of Putin's kleptocracy that fuel these activities. As the panel will elaborate, the Yukos case, the Magnitsky case, and the other cases included in Anders' report are the most important signs of where Russia is headed today. Only through understanding Putin's motivations, objectives, and the vulnerabilities he exploits will we be able to defend against and deter this activity in the future. With that, I would like to introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is a man who really needs no introduction, but in his own words, Mr. Bill Browder is Putin's #1 foreign enemy and the founder of the Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky Act. At this point, I would like to turn it over to Bill. Perhaps the rest of the panelists would like to come and take a seat while we wait for Mr. Browder. To my left, I have Mr. Pavel Ivlev. Mr. Pavel Ivlev is a Russian attorney and political refugee. He provided legal advice to the Yukos oil company. Here we go. Mr. Browder, welcome.
Hi there. Hi there. I am having a little computer trouble, but I'm back with you.
Excellent. We're happy to see you.
Great.
Go ahead.
Yes, please, go ahead.
So I missed actually your introduction. So perhaps you could just repeat like the 3 bullet points, and then I can jump in.
Well, we're so happy to have you here today, Mr. Browder, to talk about Russia's interference writ large in our society, in our judicial system, in our financial system. Certainly no one knows better than you Putin's kleptocracy and what fuels it, and all of the tools he uses in order to entrap those in the West. We're very much looking forward to your conversation in light of the comments at Helsinki that he would like to interview you, which equates our two judicial systems. So we're very much looking forward to your discussion.
Perfect. Okay. So again, sorry to make you repeat yourself.
No problem.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak today, and I'm normally not so pressed, but everybody seems to want to know what I've got to say about Helsinki. So why don't I start with Helsinki, and then we'll take a step back and look at how Vladimir Putin behaves more broadly in terms of what I call lawfare, or misuse of laws and judicial systems in order to go after his enemies. Before I do, I'm sure everybody knows me or knows of me, but let me just do my sort of 60-second background so you understand why I'm such a thorn in the side of Vladimir Putin. I was once the largest foreign investor in Russia. In that capacity, I ended up having a real insight into or seeing how corruption was taking place in large companies like Gazprom and National Savings Bank, Sberbank. I exposed that corruption. I did it through the Financial Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal. And for a while it worked. While Putin was fighting with the same oligarchs I was, he eventually won his war with the oligarchs by arresting Michael Khodorkovsky, the owner of Yukos, and putting him in jail. And then the rest of the oligarchs came to him and said, how do I not go to jail like Khodorkovsky? And his answer was 50%. And from that moment on, Putin became the richest oligarch in Russia, and my activities were no longer tolerated. I was expelled from Russia. I was declared a threat to national security. My offices were raided by the police. They seized all of our documents, and they used those documents to commit a $230 million tax rebate fraud. In other words, stealing $230 million of taxes that my firm paid to the Russian government from the Russian government. My lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, discovered the fraud. He exposed it, and in retaliation, he was subsequently arrested, put in pretrial detention, tortured for 358 days, and killed on November 16th, 2009, at the age of 37. And I made it my life's work since then to get justice for Sergei Magnitsky. And the way in which I've been able to get justice is through a mechanism called the Magnitsky Act. The Magnitsky Act freezes the assets and bans the visas of people involved in Magnitsky's false arrest, torture, and death, and people who have committed similar crimes anywhere else in Russia or anywhere else in the world at this point. And Vladimir Putin really didn't like this, and he really didn't like this because he is one of the beneficiaries of the crime that Sergei Magnitsky exposed. He's a beneficiary through Sergei Roldugin, the cellist exposed in the Panama Papers, who received some of these proceeds of this crime. And as a result, Putin feels very vulnerable. He feels as if his money that's held in the West could be frozen. The Magnitsky Act doesn't just apply to the United States anymore. It now applies to Canada, Great Britain, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Gibraltar. There are now eight other countries on deck for a Magnitsky Act, including Germany, France, Sweden, Denmark, Holland, Australia, South Africa, and Ukraine. And when Putin came back as president in 2012, he declared it his single largest foreign policy priority to stop the Magnitsky Act and have it repealed. And it's done just the opposite. It's gone viral. And so he has now taken every step a person can take with the power of a sovereign state to go after me and try to destroy me in any way he can. And I guess that's the topic of today's meeting, which is those types of tools. Now, let me start with Helsinki, and then we'll work our way backwards. Let me draw one blanket statement, which is that most civilized countries who have been approached by Vladimir Putin and his regime to come after me have rejected those approaches. He has gone to Interpol 6 times and been rejected by Interpol 6 times to issue arrest warrants for me. Interpol has a constitution that's not allowed to be used for these types of illegitimate political purposes. And although Interpol doesn't function very well, in the end, they've come to the right decision each time and rejected Russia's requests. Vladimir Putin has made 12 mutual legal assistance requests in the United Kingdom to either get information about me, have me interrogated, or have me extradited. The British government has declared that it's not in the British national interest to cooperate with these requests, and have rejected them outright. I've received preemptive letters from Germany and the Netherlands saying that they will not cooperate with the Russian Federation on any of these types of issues. And so Vladimir Putin has been having a problem for a long time on this subject, and he decided to make it a big part of the summit in Helsinki to ask for President Trump to effectively hand me over on a platter. As everybody knows, there was a quid pro quo, offering up U.S. access to these 12 GRU agents via Russian investigators, and the other thing that Vladimir Putin wants, in addition to having me handed over on a platter, is to have a number of other people involved in the Magnitsky Act or the Magnitsky investigations handed over on a platter. Vladimir Putin has asked for Kyle Parker, who is the chief of staff at the Helsinki Commission, and probably the single person in Congress who is most active on getting the Magnitsky Act passed in 2012. Vladimir Putin has asked for Bob Otto, who is an intelligence officer in the State Department, who is doing all the investigations from the State Department into the Magnitsky case leading up to the passage of the Magnitsky Act. The officials Vladimir Putin has asked for Todd Hyman and two other special agents in the Department of Homeland Security who are investigating the Preverzone case. The Preverzone case was a case in which the U.S. Department of Justice found money from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over going to New York. And so these people are being asked to be handed over. Jonathan Weiner, who is the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for narcotics and organized crime, who was the person who originally conceived of the idea of the Magnitsky Act and advised me on it. They've asked him to be handed over. They've asked David Kramer, who was a State Department official in charge of human rights at the State Department. They've asked him, and he was previously president of Freedom House, who actively lobbied for the Magnitsky Act to be handed over. And so you have this unbelievable situation in which all these people are being asked to be handed over. And then most shockingly, yesterday, Sarah Saunders Huckabee, or Senator Huckabee Saunders, said they're considering it. And I'm just aghast, mainly because here are people, most of the people on the list of Americans are people who are, these are not people who are doing any of their work for glory. They were doing work as their duties for serving the United States of America. They were servants of the government and servants of the government trying to protect the United States against Russian malfeasance and Russian organized crime and Russian money laundering. And effectively, Trump is considering handing them over to an enemy state. And that has got to be the most shocking part of this whole story. I don't know really how much more I should go on. If you want to, I'm happy to talk for longer about Interpol or whatever, but I don't want to dominate the conversation.
Love to hear your thoughts on Interpol, Mr. Browder. Absolutely. We know that you have been a victim of many Interpol red notices. So if you could talk about your experience and perhaps some of the changes that you would like to see in the Interpol system.
Interpol is so I've probably gotten to know Interpol better than most people, almost anybody in the world, because of all the different interactions I've had with them in relation to Russia asking for my arrest. As I mentioned at the beginning of my talk, Russia has applied at this point, as of today, 7 times for my arrest. They've been rejected so far 6 times, and their current request is pending, I believe. The most recent and most outrageous of these situations was on May 30th of this year. I was going to Madrid, Spain, on the invitation of Jose Grinda. Jose Grinda is the head anti-corruption prosecutor in Spain. And we've been working with Jose Grinda, having identified 30 million euros from the crime that Sergei Magnitsky discovered and was killed over, going to buy luxury properties in Spain on the coast. And so we were invited by Jose Grinda. I was invited to come and give evidence about this discovery. I was supposed to be there at 11 a.m. in the morning on the 30th of May. And at 9:40 a.m. that morning, two police officers from the Spanish National Police came to my hotel, came to the door of my hotel, asked me to present my identification, compared it with the piece of paper that they had, and then told me I was under arrest under a Russian Interpol arrest warrant. I was fortunate that I had enough time to tweet out that I was being arrested, and this set the whole world in a state of outrage, because why would they be arresting me and handing me over to Putin in this type of terrible situation? And so by the time I got to the police station, and about an hour later, I think 100 journalists had called Interpol, 100 more journalists had called the Spanish police, 100 more had called the British government. I'm a British citizen. And in the end, Interpol told the Russians, or told the Spanish, to release me right away. And so I was released, and I was able to get to my meeting with Jose Grinda 45 minutes late and carried on with my mission. But what this says is that Russia can and does use these international legal mechanisms like Interpol against its enemies, and I'm the prime example. It's not just Interpol. Russia uses every international legal mechanism. I was sued in London in 2013 by Major Pavel Karpov of the Moscow Interior Ministry. Major Karpov has a total annual compensation, had a total annual compensation of about $15,000 a year, and he hired the most expensive libel lawyers in the city of London, Andrew Caldecott QC, and the firm Åslund, to try to prosecute me for libel. And we were eventually, after spending an enormous amount of money, were able to get the case dismissed. And in England, when your case is dismissed, we got it dismissed as an abusive process, the people who brought the case are supposed to pay your legal fees. But guess what? The moment that he lost the case, Pavel Karpov disappeared into the ether. His law firm disappeared into the ether, and we ended up getting stuck with a £600,000 bill that we couldn't get reimbursed. We applied to the court, and in the end, we got an arrest warrant for Pavel Karpov. And so if he ever sets foot in the United Kingdom, he'll be arrested. That's a small consolation for a £600,000 bill that was unreimbursed. Another case that they came after me with was a case involving bankruptcy. Basically, the Russians created a fake bankruptcy in Russia. They then took that fake bankruptcy and used something called the cross-border insolvency regime, which is a law that allows countries to enforce each other's bankruptcy laws. And normally, every country assumes that everyone else is operating in good faith. But in this case, the Russians came up with an absolute fake bankruptcy. And it was basically a bankruptcy based on the supposed tax monies that I and Sergei Magnitsky had evaded in the posthumous trial against Sergei Magnitsky. So they came up with this fake bankruptcy, and then they tried to register it in the British courts. And they registered it on an ex parte basis, which means that I wasn't even there to protest it. They just went to a judge and said, "Here's a bankruptcy from Russia. We want to now enforce this bankruptcy." And so they went to the court. The court didn't know there was anything going on and awarded it. And then we had to spend about a year and a half fighting it. We fought it. We won. In this particular case, we were awarded all of our costs back, and they were thoroughly defeated. But if I hadn't had the resources to fight it, then I would be in a terrible situation right now, because it costs a lot of money to fight these things. And there was another case, and I don't want to go on for too long because this might be boring, but in which the United States government brought a case against Preverzone being a company that received some of the proceeds of the crime that Sergei Magnitsky discovered and was killed over. Preverzone bought properties in New York. The US government brought a case against Preverzone, a civil forfeiture case, and I was one of the witnesses in the civil forfeiture case. And so in an effort to basically gather as much information as they could on me, they used US discovery rules to ask for effectively every document I'd ever created in my firm over the last 20 years. So they were effectively asking for my entire life to be handed over to the FSB. And we fought this, and we lost. The judge, who was a very pedantic judge, said, "Well, it looks like a reasonable request to me. Every litigant is entitled to any information they want in the civil procedure." Didn't understand that this was money. This was information going to the FSB. And we ended up having to produce, I think, 400,000 pages of documents from all of our internal workings. They were asking for things like what journalists we were in touch with, and sources of information, whistleblowers, my security arrangements, my tax returns, all sorts of stuff that had nothing to do with the case, basically just to get hold of that information. The Russian government basically you will use every tool in their book in abusing international laws in order to try to destroy their opponents. I'm probably one of the prime examples. I'm sure there's some others. I know that the Michael Hordakovsky from UCOS has similar types of issues, and I'm sure there are many others. And this is not an unusual story. I just happen to be more outspoken about it than most. I think I'll leave it at that.
Well, and we will hear about the UCOS case in just a couple of moments, but what you describe is the essence of why we're here. It's the systematic abuse of our rule of law systems. And I would like to hear from you, since I know you have to depart. But Putin equivocates our two judicial systems. Just the request to interview you is proof of that. How should we handle these manipulations of our rule of law systems, knowing that they will be used to malign ends?
Well, it's become clear to me, and I've made the case very convincingly in Britain that, and I think at this point the government, anyways, understands this, which is that the Russian government is a corrupt government. They have no rule of law there. The courts are not independent, and therefore, effectively, anything coming out of Russia has to be looked at with extreme skepticism and pessimism, and any criminal request has to be effectively rejected until it's proven that it's legitimate, because what comes out of Russia almost uniformly is not legitimate, and to the extent that governments and courts treat these things as legitimate, it does a terrible disservice to people like myself and all other people who are victims of this regime.
Thank you. Mr. Browder, do we have you for a few more minutes, or?
Yeah.
Okay, so I do have another question for you, and this is regarding a complaint that you brought against Danske Bank earlier this month for money laundering, and I would like to hear from you. What does this Danske Bank case tell us about how Russian money is laundered in the West, and what should we do better to combat it?
So let me give a little bit of background to the complaint that was launched. So when Sergei Magnitsky was killed 8.5 years ago, we tried to get justice for him in the form of criminal justice for torture and murder. And the Putin regime circled the wagons and exonerated everybody involved. Vladimir Putin personally got involved in the exoneration process. And therefore, we took a very important step, which was we said that if we can't get them for torture or murder in Russia, let's go after them in the West for money laundering for the $230 million. And let's also go after anybody who enabled them to do that. And so for the last 8.5 years, we've conducted a very, very detailed money laundering investigation. I've got a full team of investigators full-time working on this. And as a result of that, we have found out where the $230 million went that Sergei Magnitsky exposed and was killed over. And it went to a lot of different places. And every time we find a place that it's gone to, we file a criminal complaint with the law enforcement authorities of that country. And we filed 26 criminal complaints, and there are 15 live money laundering investigations going on around the world. And one of the countries where we found the money going in at an early step was Denmark. In 2013, we filed a complaint with the Danish authorities, and the Danish authorities rejected opening a criminal case. So it's not one of the 15 live investigations, which is kind of surprising because Denmark is actually considered to be a very sort of modern, efficient country. And the fact that they were refusing to open a criminal case when Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, and Cyprus were was quite extraordinary. Then as we started progressing through all of these criminal cases in different countries, we got access to more information. In many countries, we're considered to be what they call an injured party or a qualified plaintiff, which allows us to get access to the criminal case files. And in one of those criminal case files, we discovered the most unbelievable flows of money going through a subsidiary of Danske Bank in Estonia, or not a subsidiary, I should say a branch of Danske Bank in Estonia. And we found just truly enormous amounts of money going through this branch. And it wasn't just in the crime that we had discovered about Magnitsky, but it looked like hugely suspicious transactions going through the same accounts at that bank for other reasons. And we then refiled very recently a complaint with the Danish authorities to try to get them to investigate. And I'm thinking now that they will investigate, because this has turned into a scandal inside Denmark, a country where people are justifiably proud of their country. This is not something that they can be proud of. And so there's a huge public opinion that this needs to be properly investigated by the law enforcement authorities, and that if there are people who are culpable inside that bank, that they should also be held responsible. And so that's what we're doing. It's we're not just targeting Danske Bank, we're targeting many banks and many individuals all over the world who played a role in this. And there will be many more discoveries and disclosures in the future on this case.
Thank you. I would also like to ask you about, given your work with Congress, and I worked for Senator Cardin for a number of years on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and was very involved in the passage of the Global Magnitsky Act. Given the problems you've described with money laundering, with subversion of the rule of law, how do you recommend we continue to target these figures that perpetrate these activities? Is the sanctions framework already in place, or is there another role for Congress in trying to tackle these issues?
Well, I first of all, thank you for your work on the Global Magnitsky Act, which I would describe as probably the single most effective tool in fighting kleptocracy that exists in the face of the planet right now, and everybody who played a part in that deserves great credit for now and in the future. This is going to be that piece of legislation is historic, and because it basically creates dire consequences for bad actors in the world in a way that doesn't require the same type of resources to go after those bad actors. When you're doing a money laundering investigation, you've got to, in the United States, you have to find the money, you've got to prove the money came from the source, you've got to build up a credible, a very detailed case, and often those cases are very hard to prove, and sometimes those cases, they bring in the most expensive defense lawyers to like muddy up the waters for years. Whereas the Global Magnitsky Act does something different, which is it still requires huge evidence, and it requires solid evidence, but it doesn't require this hugely long and resource-consuming process. And so when the United States Department of the Treasury sanctions somebody on the Global Magnitsky Act, they're not only sanctioned for their money in the United States, but every bank of the world will stop doing business with that person because they don't want to be in violation of US Treasury sanctions. And there was an expression that once that came out during the Colombian drug wars, where they were using a similar tool to sanction Colombian drug lords. And when the Treasury sanctioned those drug lords, even in their supposed legitimate businesses, the drug lords described it in Spanish as muerte civil, which means civil death. And that is what the Global Magnitsky Act does. So coming back to what can be done to improve it, there's always tweaks that can be done to improve it. But at this point, the main thing that needs to be done is it needs to be implemented as it has been being implemented on a regular and consistent, and I would say pedestrian basis. There's many people that are well known to be bad actors. There's plenty of evidence about those bad actors, and this needs to become something where it's done so frequently to bad people that guys or women or anyone in countries thinking about doing something bad will look at the potential consequences of being included on the Global Magnitsky list and not do those things.
Thank you, Mr. Browder. Do we have time for a few more, or shall we turn to the rest of the panel?
I've got a few more minutes, but I don't want to monopolize. There's a lot of good people here who have a lot of important things to say. So
sure. Well, I would actually like to open it up to the audience for some questions, since we will be losing you in a couple of minutes. Okay. Would anyone have a question for Mr. Browder? Yes, this woman right here. Do we have a microphone?
Hi, I'm Kristen Shergate with the Caspian Policy Center, and you touched on it, which makes my question a lot easier to ask. So when we were talking about the rule of law, and I'm aware that U.S. judges, like you had mentioned, are allowed to consider evidence questioning the legitimacy of a foreign judicial decision. And you also mentioned that the U.S. courts are hesitant to speculate on whether another country upholds the rule of law. But because such a decision to say that a country does not have a rule of law, like if we were to decide that Russia does not, it requires significant analysis that is far beyond the scope and ability of most U.S. courts. How do you think the U.S. judiciary system can better equip itself to go against Russian incursion?
Well, I think that I don't think that one can ever sort of reject evidence from other places outright, because there may be legitimate claims in some place at some point in the future. But I think that if a policy decision is made that at a government level, that evidence coming from Russia should be assumed to be tainted unless proven otherwise. In other words, the burden of proof should be shifted from taking at face value Russian claims or Russian judgments to assuming that they're not legitimate unless the case can be proven otherwise. And a good comparable to this in the UK, if somebody has a claim, let's say they bring a claim that's been a judgment in a Russian court for some amount of money, and they bring it to the UK court, the UK court won't accept that it won't accept it as is. They will actually require that they relitigate it in the UK court. And I think that's the sort of standard at which this stuff has to happen. I don't think anyone should be denied justice just as an absolute rule, but I think that if there's a predominance of abuse, then that should be taken into account, and the issues have to be relitigated in the U.S. Court proceedings.
Great, and we have one more question over here.
Thanks for tuning in, Mr. Browder. I'm Tom Melia. We met when I was at the State Department, and you were pursuing this. You were educating us on this a few years ago. I'm now with PEN America, and you alluded to something that caught my ear, which was the amount of resources and personnel that you have invested in this quest to expose Russian kleptocracy and other criminality. I wonder if you could give us a ballpark of what kind of operation you have. You mentioned, you kind of threw out a number of 600,000 pounds it cost you to wage one battle in a British court, that you did not get reimbursed. Some other transactions you do find you can reclaim the costs. I mean, these begin to be large amounts of money. You also talked about how many investigators you have working in many different countries. Can you give us a sense of what, and the reason I'm asking is that it's both impressive and daunting to think about how someone else could do this. Even another government. Having been in the U.S. government, I know how tight resources are, how hard it is to marshal people to work full-time on a particular project or investigation. It sounds like you've outmatched the resources, perhaps, that most governments are putting into this. Can you give us a sense of what the ballpark is?
Yeah. Sure. Well, Tom, great to see you again, and thank you for the great work you did in the U.S. government with us during that period of time, fighting the terrible things going on in Russia. Well, let me start out with a simple thought, which is not a good one, which is that when you fight evil, evil tends to fight back, and they fight back hard, and it makes it very hard for anybody to fight evil. And I'm in an unusual position because I have resources to fight back when evil fights back at me, and I'm able to manage it effectively and carry on strongly. The resources that I have or the resources that I have to spend on this effort are significant. I don't raise money from outside parties. I don't, for a simple reason that the steps that I take are often make a lot of enemies. And if I had a board of directors, they would never allow me to create these types of enemies. But I can do this on my own. But it's not, so the Russians accuse me of all sorts of crazy stuff. They just a couple days ago, they accused me of putting $400 million into Hillary Clinton's campaign. They walked it back the next day to 400,000. Neither number is true. It's zero. I don't spend money on political donations at all. But it is an expensive operation by any stretch of the imagination. But in my case, I was fortunate enough to have earned a good living as a investment fund manager, and I've been able to take some of the savings from my activities and apply it towards this, which is my life's work now. I don't want to give any financial estimates of how much I've spent or how much I intend to spend, because that just gives my enemies some idea of how much they have to use, what they have to do to try to drain me of my resources. What I can say is that in a lot of situations, in most situations, the people that work with us, lawyers work with us pro bono, lobbyists work with us pro bono, and I try to keep the cost down wherever I can, so that I can do this for a long, long time into the future, into the perpetuity, perhaps. But in exact numbers, I don't want to put that number out there.
Do we have time for one more question, Mr. Browder?
One more question, and then I do have to run.
Okay, we have a question right over here, sir. Yes.
Thank you very much, Alexander Kravitz from Insight. If Donald Trump were sitting here among the audience, what would you tell him?
Well, I wrote a letter to Donald Trump last week that I published in Time magazine, which was my advice to him about who Vladimir Putin was. And I told him that Vladimir Putin doesn't negotiate. He's a total bluffer. He's got a pair of twos. The United States has a full house. That Donald Trump is a bald-faced liar. That Vladimir Putin is a bald-faced liar. That Vladimir Putin is a killer, and that anything that ever gets agreed to is not going to end up. He's not going to follow through, and so as a result of this, I mean, if he actually knew who he's dealing with and he was sincere about making America great again, he should be isolating Vladimir Putin, not engaging him. And this idea of handing me over as some kind of quid pro quo, he should know that if I ever got handed over to the Russians, he would be handing me over to my death.
On that note, thank you, Mr. Browder. That is an ominous note to leave on. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for this opportunity, and I wish you a good rest of the conference. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mr. Ivlev, hello. Mr. Ivlev, we'll recommence, is a Russian attorney and political refugee. He provided legal advice to the Yukos Oil Company and its CEO, Michel Khodorkovsky. He became a partner in the ALM Feldman's law firm that was later destroyed by Russian law enforcement authorities in the context of the Yukos case. He was forced to leave Russia for New York City, where he founded the Committee for Russian Economic Freedom to campaign for free market and civic freedoms in Russia. Mr. Anders Åslund also does not need an introduction, however, I will provide one. Is a resident senior fellow in the Eurasia Center at the Atlantic Council. He has served as an economic advisor to several governments, notably Russia and Ukraine. He's chairman of the Advisory Council of the Center for Social and Economic Research in Warsaw, and of the Scientific Council of the Bank of Finland Institute for Economies in Transition. He is a prolific author of 14 books, including Ukraine, What Went Wrong, and How to Fix It. Mr. Michel, Casey Michel, is a reporter with Think Progress who has covered and broken numerous stories on Russian interference efforts in the US, from social media operations to the NRA and religious right infiltration. I, Brittany Beaulieu, am a fellow and program officer at the Alliance for Securing Democracy at the German Marshall Fund of the United States. I previously advised Chairman Menendez and Ranking Member Cardin on the Europe, Eurasia, and Central Asia portfolio for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Thank you very much for attending. Mr. Ivlev, I'd like to hand it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. Well, I really have personal experience with the Yukos case, and I was charged with the same millions of tons and billions of rubles, which allegedly been embezzled by Khodorkovsky, so I'm part of his group. So that give me, of course, much better knowledge of the case compared to even other lawyers like myself. But I would like to speak really more about the impact which me and the others who left Russia and who've been impacted with the UCAS case, how we, basically what we feel here, being, of course, protected by the United States, but still, the international legal cooperation is the thing which works, even in between the United States and the Russian Federation. There is an agreement, bilateral agreement in place on the mutual legal assistance, which basically allows things like interrogations or searches. So if one country, say Russia, requests American federal government agency to do something like interrogate someone or search someone's office or demand certain documents, that has to be done. That's the mutual legal assistance prescribed by the treaty. And that, again, it's not happened too often, it's not really harmful, but it is what it is. So I was served with certain documents by the request of Russians here. So ICE officers knocked my door and brought some papers to me. FBI officers come to my home and asked me questions and even demanded my attorney certificate because Russians wanted to have it for whatever reason. Of course, I rejected this demand. So what is not possible is the extradition. The extradition is specifically excluded from the this agreement between Russian Federation and the US. So that is why when Russians requested my extradition from the US, this was rejected. But there are still, I'm naturalized American, but there are American-born UCAS top managers who live in this country and treated as the suspects in the UCAS case. So they live with this, and I remind you, UCAS case is 15 years old. And it is an ongoing fight. It's an ongoing battle, which involved, a lot of resources. Law firms, world-named law firms like White & Case or DeBois Plimpton represent Russian Federation in this fight. So millions of dollars been spent on these legal battles, and then that continues. And let me maybe switch a little bit to the Interpol side of this issue. Compared to Bill, who Russian Federation just attempted to raise a red notice on him, I had my red notice on myself for 9.5 years within the UCAS case. So again, that was a big battle, not just for me. There were 28 persons, UCAS-related persons, who've been given their red notices. And there was some suffering for all of us, more or less, because some were arrested, detained, some were in extraditions. It's all gone just 2 years ago, basically, and then we worked on that hardly, and that finally persuaded the Interpol headquarters in Lyon to cancel these notices, and in my case, they found that the UCAS case was political. That is the reason for Interpol not to pursue the international search, even if they requested to do it by the member country. And again, what is Interpol? It's a computer database. 190 countries of this world are members. They have same vote. So Iran has the same vote as the United States, and the chairman of Interpol currently is a Chinese police general. So that organization is supposed not to be, treated as granted what they do or their red notices, but unfortunately, police, including U.S. police or U.S. immigration police, in fact, they normally follow the red notices. And in my recent practice representing Russian refugees here in the U.S., I have 5 persons who had their red notices who've been detained by ICE here in the US, and ICE demand to keep these people in jail in the US without bail. So they clearly demand any chance of bail to these refugees or asylum seekers, and it is basically up to the immigration judge either to agree with ICE or with the prosecution or not. And out of 5, 2 of my clients remain in jail for more than a year because ICE just followed red notices from the Interpol. Whatever, they don't care, basically. This is police cooperation, so that's what they care about. They don't care about human rights. So that's just what's going on around, in spite of all this political situation and then what Russia is doing in Ukraine and in Syria or wherever. That's it.
Pavel, that is very discouraging what you were just describing about the red notice and asylum seekers, and I'd really like to kind of drive towards solutions in this conversation. So have you thought at all about what type of solution would kind of bring this practice to a halt?
Well, first of all, this practice is something new. I never heard about such cases like 2-3 years ago. It's recent. I'm not blaming the current administration, but it's been much more actively, enforced by the currently. What can be done? Well, there's no issue. Whether to give a person a bail and let him go on that bail is a very routine and it's a very standard process in the United States justice. And normally people get bail. The reason not to give it is the risk of flight or danger for the society. Well, it's easy to just for an immigration judge to say and analyze. I'm pretty sure that any federal judge or a state judge, normal judge, because immigration judge is not a judge, it's an officer of the immigration service of the United States. So they sometimes do not understand, sometimes they do. It's just apply, it's not a political science, just apply the laws of the United States, see whether the person is a risk of flight or not, or the person is normal human being who lives here with a family and make money for a living. Yeah. That's it.
Mr. Åslund. Yes.
Yes, thank you. Let me first advertise this report that we are launching today, Russia's interference in the US Judiciary. And the reason for this report is very much what you have heard from Bill Browder and from Pavel Ivlev here, that this is a serious phenomenon. And we, of course, Bill Browder has done a magnificent job by emphasizing the Magnitsky case and driving it home fully, and a large group of people have pushed the Yukos case. But it's not only them. In Russia today, any day, there are about 200,000 Russian businessmen sitting in pre-trial detention, in the same way as Sergei Magnitsky sat and died. And this is essentially extortion. Most of these people are being let out after they have paid their due. And this due is not to the government, it is to specific people who are supposed to represent the government. And the Magnitsky case, I think, better than anything, shows it. Ambassador Daniel Fried, who was deeply involved in it, and at State Department, he uses to say that the Magnitsky case went to a much higher level than we ever expected. And this is the very point about it. Bill Browder mentioned this case that President Putin himself was the beneficiary of $800,000 of the Magnitsky loot of 230 million. You, of course, then immediately say, why should Putin, who's worth anything between 100 and 200 billion dollars, bother about $800,000? So I asked one of my wealthy Russian friends this question, and he said, you don't understand. A thief is a person who's interested in getting as much money as possible. A racketeer is not interested in getting a lot of money, he's interested in controlling the turf. Putin is a racketeer, he's not a thief. And that's quite an important distinction, because that tells you about how the Russian system under Putin works. This is an organized crime syndicate. That's how we should see it. Or as late Karen Darwisha wrote so very well, this is an authoritarian kleptocracy. And then it becomes much more clear. Should we treat Russian judicial authorities as judicial authorities? No, we should deal with them as organized criminals, and that's the rules that should apply. And then, of course, red notices from Russia is an absurdity. And the burden of proof, as Bill said here, must be shifted. So it's both the nature of it and the scale. And then what I particularly wanted to do in this report, it is to show how it is intruding into the US system. Because you heard what Pavel discussed here, how the US authorities are treating, for example, red notices, that this is quite impermissible. And that the US treatment of red notices must change throughout. But it's also coming over to the US legislation. I'm not a lawyer, I'm an economist, but I had to learn a bit about these things. And there are particularly three issues in the US legislation. One is discovery, that Bill talked about, which offers very liberal possibilities for Russian authorities to dig into private people and find out all kinds of information that then can be used by other means. The second is the bankruptcy code, which simply says that a bankruptcy in another country can be implemented, enforced here in the US, which means that a fake bankruptcy in Russia carried out by law enforcement agents in order to enrich themselves, that can be, the loot can be collected in this country. That must be stopped. And the third thing is more general, that generally the US legal code suggests that the US can enforce verdicts by that have been undertaken in courts in other countries. This also must stop. And these are the three big things that need to change. And here the US has two very useful legal acts, the Magnitsky Act and the Global Magnitsky Act. What is useful about these is that they say that certain people are odious and one should not accept anything from them. In December last year, two young, bright Muscovites, Andrei Pavlov, 41, and his wife Yulia Mayorova, 39, good-looking young people, as bright as they come. They run the law firm Quorum in Moscow, but they were sanctioned last December on the Magnitsky list because they have contributed seriously to that. They have been involved in several cases of hundreds of millions of dollars of collecting money in this country to their benefit and to the benefit of the clue of organized crime group in Moscow that are, of course, working together with the prosecutor's office, the Minister of Interior, and the investigative committee in Russia. And you can also see that the head of the investigative committee, Alexander Bastrikin, who happens to be a law school friend of Putin from St. Petersburg, is sanctioned on the Magnitsky list. And the oldest son of a prosecutor general, Yuri Chaika, Artyom Chaika, he is sanctioned on the global Magnitsky list after Alexei Navalny revealed he and his brother as leading organized criminals who are using their father's many deputies for their organized crime activities. So we have to get this conceptualization into our head. And the question today, I know what you will ask me, is what do we do about it in this country? And this is where I think that we need to start thinking. Obviously, this should be subject to hearings in the relevant committees in the Congress. I've written in the report that it should be the judicial committees. Brittany will immediately say that it should be Foreign Relations Committee. But it's also the Helsinki Committee that could take this up. This cannot continue. Something needs to be done. And it would be natural to start with congressional hearings. And another is that the State Department and the Department of Justice should issue general instructions that we cannot accept Russian judicial evidence any longer. That should be outright rejected. And then, of course, these viewpoint needs to go through into the legal system. This cannot go on. Something must change. Thank you.
Thank you, Anders. You're right, I was going to ask what role is there for Congress, but I don't need to ask that anymore. Mr. Browder was talking about how the UK is actually is combating this activity more effectively than the United States. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about what the UK is doing, and if you know of any kind of mechanism of sharing of best practices and lessons learned, any way that we could kind of incorporate what the UK is doing into our legal system, given the differences.
Well, the big difference between the UK and other countries is that they have had much more experience, because they have so many Russians living there, so they have to see who is who in quite another way. I think that the US probably is number 2 in understanding this, while we are seeing that the odd red notices happen in places like Greece and Cyprus, where they have had less control of it. You simply have to learn that Russian evidence cannot be taken at face value, and the Brits have learned it better than others. The US is ahead of most.
Thank you. Mr. Michel.
I wanted to make just a few comments today, because I know we have more questions to get to, discussing how Anders' report fits within the broader thrust of everything we know, have learned, especially over the past week, of broader Russian interference efforts. I think one of the things that Anders' report does so well is not only laying out the structure of the judicial interference, but the almost at its purest form, the pure legality of it all. Whether it is the out-of-court settlements that we saw in the Prevezon case, whether it is the recognition of foreign verdicts, as we've seen in cases discussed by both Mr. Browder as well as Anders. These are forms of what Mr. Browder described as lawfare. This is something that is, again, at its basis level, purely a legal mechanism. Now, if we examine that in a kind of contradistinction to everything else we've learned about Russian interference over the past few years, past few months, past week, whether it's social media, whether it's civic organizations, social conservative organizations, obviously whether it's the hacking, these all maintained and contained illicit or illegal components within them. So if it's the social media manipulation and interference, The Internet Research Agency, obviously run out of St. Petersburg, combined illegal payments for maintenance, for operation, for travel, whether it is everything we saw with Mrs. Butina and the NRA that came out from the DOJ in its complaint and indictment over the past few days. She obviously did not register with the Attorney General, and her lobbying or espionage, whatever term you'd like to use, efforts were in and of themselves illegal. So there are illicit components, and obviously the hacking in and of itself, a purely illegal effort. So there are aspects within those that contain illicit aspects, but there are also legal aspects. If we go back again to the social media components, there's nothing legally that says that I or Brittany or any one of you can go out and create a Facebook page that purports to be XYZ. The page that I followed from early 2016, far before the Mueller indictment came out, it's called the Heart of Texas page. This is a page that organized white supremacists down in Houston to bring their arms downtown. It's a page that grew more popular than the Texas Democrat, Texas Republican pages combined. And this is during the middle of the 2016 election. There was nothing illegal about that. It was perfectly legal. Or if we take, again, Ms. Butina and the NRA, her meetings, her questioning of Donald Trump, her sit-downs with Rick Santorum and Bobby Jindal and the higher-ups of the NRA, the fact that she was a special guest at the NRA conventions, none of that was illegal. That was perfectly legal. She just didn't register. If she'd done that, maybe she would have been able to do the exact same thing. But if she'd registered, as far as we know right now, it would have been fine. So I think that points to something that Anders' report can help us extend into the future, is that everything he's found, everything he's uncovered and described thus far has been, again, perfectly legal. But that isn't to say that there aren't aspects of these cases or aspects of this broader Russian interference in the judiciary moving forward that will be illicit, that will be illegal. And I think there's another aspect within that. If we go back to social media, if we go back to civic organizations, if we go back to the hacking, that indicates that these companies, tech companies, Facebook, Twitter, law enforcement agencies, Department of Treasury, Department of Justice are finally waking up, or finally realizing, or finally implementing specific policies to combat this type of interference. And it is past time that the American judiciary do the same. Anders obviously has his recommendations, and they should be implemented as quickly as possible. So.
Thank you for that.
You're welcome.
I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, something that is a thread throughout this conversation is that the Russians are using the openness of our societies against us. They're using our free media space. They're using our rule of law space. And that actually leads into my next question that I'd like to pose to all of you is, the exploitation of the US justice system is fundamentally the same as the exploitation of our social media sphere. So how does an open society founded on the rule of law and liberal democratic values cope with targeted asymmetric threats without compromising these core values? Yes, please.
I think that the answer is quite obvious. By demanding complete openness, in the Nordic countries, virtually everything is public. All tax returns in the Nordic countries are public. Then you can't bribe very easily because the money is clear. In the US today, there's an enormous amount of money that is moving around, that is anonymous. Bring it all into the open. The US Treasury 3 years ago published, the case is written about this, that $300 billion a year is laundered in this country. The US is the center of money laundering in the world by far. And if you are a money laundering center, then you have a lot of corrupt activities, and Russians are the best at corruption. They are outstanding. And I should not say Russians, I should say Putin's Kremlin, because an important part here is that decent Russians, like Pavel, should be treated decently. It should not be a matter of nationality. It should be if you are working for Putin or not.
just to echo Andrew's comment, he's exactly right. The key word is transparency at the end of the day. And we already have certain mechanisms to encourage and enforce that transparency. Now, while we don't have it as it pertains to things like beneficial ownership, shell companies, boutique trusts, which I'm sure we'll discuss a little bit later on, we do have it as it pertains to things like foreign lobbying or lobbying on behalf of foreign governments or foreign principals. You know, and it wasn't until this current administration, especially the campaign and a certain gentleman named Paul Manafort came along, that anyone thought twice about enforcing the regulations within the Foreign Agents Registration Act. This is something that's been on the books since 1938. There have been a half dozen convictions over the past half century. That's reprehensible. That's embarrassing. I think certainly one of the silver linings of the current administration, and especially the campaign, is that there is brand new life in these mechanisms that we already have on the books, and that, again, are past time to be enforced, all in the sake of transparency. So if Ms. Butina had registered with FARA or with the AG, she could have done everything that she did that we're aware of. But everyone, NRA higher-ups, Republican higher-ups that she met with would have known or have been incapable of claiming plausible deniability that she was working on behalf of a foreign government or foreign principal.
Just can add here that it's very, very difficult, especially on the legal front, because of the huge complications of all these rules and laws and what is legal, what is illegal. Well, that's the most difficult question you always need to answer.
Let me add here one thing. In this report, I've carefully not mentioned any US law firm. Because a US law firm, if it's mentioned in a negative context, will immediately sue you. Therefore, you never see any negative information about US law firms.
So, Casey, in our earlier discussion, we were talking about anonymous company formation, and I was wondering, since we have touched on anonymous companies so often in this conversation, if you could briefly walk us through anonymous company formation and talk about where we're at right now with regulating these entities, perhaps touch on the legislation that is now being debated on the Hill.
Yeah, sure. Well, as Anders again just mentioned a moment ago, the U.S. over the past maybe decade, maybe 15 years or so, has transitioned into one of the primary global offshore havens for kleptocratic financing, whether it's real estate purchases, whether it's shell company formation, whether it's boutique trusts, what have you, you name it, the U.S. can provide it. Now, this actually exists in opposition to federal oversight mechanisms that have actually clamped down on offshoring elsewhere, places like Switzerland, the EU, et cetera. The U.S.'s transition has been mainly driven not at a top-down type mechanism or pattern. It's been bottom-up. And I say that in the sense that it's been state-led rather than led by anything here in Washington. States like Delaware, Wyoming, Nevada have all developed these state-level industries that provide the types of anonymity and protect that kind of anonymity for exactly the actors that have also been pursuing the types of judicial interference that we've seen from Russia, as well as from other kleptocracies, other autocracies, and other regions. These states, unfortunately, have come to rely so heavily on this industry, whether it's in Nevada, using it to fund their public school teachers, whether it's in Wyoming, helping fund their general budget, whether it's in Delaware. At last check, I think it was about 40% of the state budget was reliant on anonymous company formation. Ungodly numbers that have driven this race to the bottom that has allowed the U.S. to transition into this offshore haven. And that's been going on for years, and we've seen, maybe the name Victor Bout is familiar to some of you. He's one of the foremost arms dealers over the past 20 years. There was a great Nicolas Cage movie about him called Lord of War. That was him. He set up American shell companies in places like Texas, Delaware, Florida to help funnel arms to groups like the Taliban. The first family in Equatorial Guinea, one of the most dictatorial regimes this side of North Korea, set up shell companies here in the U.S. Pavlo Lazarenko, the former Ukrainian prime minister, once ranked one of the top 10 kleptocrats globally by Transparency International, came to the U.S., came to Wyoming. Cheyenne, Wyoming is where he set up his companies. Thankfully, things might be starting to change. Maybe. We'll see. There was legislation that was very close to passing very recently, just as recently as last month. It was the Financial Transparency Bill, as it was, contained language that would have required the U.S. Federally to collect information on who is setting up these companies, the beneficial owners. The U.S. doesn't have a beneficial ownership registry just like so many other countries do. Now, unfortunately, that language was stripped from the bill. No one's quite sure why or how. But fortunately, thereafter, the bill was actually pulled, and they're back in negotiations to get that language readmitted so the U.S. can finally join the rest of the, I think as we said earlier, civilized world in beneficial ownership oversight. So we can keep our fingers crossed. I think the best sign thus far is that the Delaware Secretary of State, which is in charge of setting up companies in the state, the Secretary of State level, actually, and very surprisingly, came forth just last month and said, it's time. We need this. Now, Nevada, Wyoming haven't followed suit yet, but Delaware is the big apple. Well, not the big apple, that's New York. But Delaware is the big get there. And that was a good sign.
Excellent. We know that money laundering is an international concern, and it fuels Putin's kleptocracy. How do we encourage and improve international coordination to actually address this issue? Yes.
The European Union actually adopted the fourth anti-money laundering directive in May 2015. And when the EU adopts a directive, normally countries need to adopt laws to that effect 2 years later, and then in each case it's about 2 years when these laws should come into full effect. So this anti-money laundering directive demands that all EU countries reveal all beneficiary owners of everything. And then it's a choice of the countries. Either it can be to the public, which is what about half the EU countries are opting for, or it can be only to law enforcement. And the other half are opting for that. And this is going through. So by the end of 2020, this should essentially be true of the whole of the European Union. And the UK Parliament 2 months ago adopted a law that forced all British overseas territories, I think it's 13 of them, to reveal all beneficiary owners until the end of 2020. And this includes, importantly, the British Virgin Islands and the Cayman Islands, which are really the only two big outstanding money laundering holdouts among the British overseas territories today.
I was just going to add, and there was sufficient pushback in the Cayman Islands that there was a public protest against beneficial ownership oversight in the Cayman Islands. Now, that didn't do much, but I think it does tell you the kind of state of affairs of just how reliant these overseas territories, as well as some of the states here in the U.S., can be. That's what generates a public protest out on the streets.
Cayman Islands,
in the Cayman Islands,
20,000 population and 500 banks.
People need their banks. Absolutely.
May I oppose a little bit? Two things. This anti-money laundering cooperation is basically now an international treaty. Russian Federation is a part of it. So under the new rules, all the beneficiaries of bank accounts in Europe has to be notified, if they are Russians, has to be notified to Kremlin. That's also the other side of the international anti-money laundering campaign. So, and again, another problem which been basically created by this campaign, which is of course a good and necessary thing, I don't dispute that. However, because of the really difficulty for the banks, it's time consuming for the bankers to analyze who opens accounts with them and what they do. A lot of small and mid-sized internationally trading companies' bank accounts were simply closed because bankers do not want to deal with them. So that's against the international trade to some extent, if you really hardly enforce these regulations against the people who simply trade internationally.
Thank you. Well, I know we have a very distinguished audience here. I would like to open it up to questions. Yes, in the back. Do we have a microphone?
Hi, thank you so much for the panel. Hey there, Dr. Åslund, great to see you again. I'm Paul Massaro with the Helsinki Commission. I do international anti-corruption. So we had a staff level briefing recently that was actually moderated by my colleague here, Rachel Bauman, who is our new Russia advisor. And we had someone there from the Echo of Moscow, Yulia Latinina. I asked her about essentially this kind of financial corruption type stuff. You know, the way that money is coming into the States and the UK and everywhere else. And she had a really interesting answer for me. She said, we need to start treating all Russian money as bad money. It's all bad. You know, I mean, when such a large percentage of it is bad, we just need to treat it as all bad. And, you know, I'm kind of coming to that conclusion too slowly the more I see these criminal interference in the judiciary type things. You know, if your courts are 98% politicized, you know, they're politicized. You know, you really can't, you know, try to be like, well, but the 2%, you know. So I think about, you know, back in the Soviet Union, if a judge got a verdict from a Soviet court, you know, he wouldn't take it seriously at all. You know, he'd throw it out immediately, no problem. So, you know, I mean, my question is twofold. It's, you know, what do we get by continuing to have authoritarian kleptocratic regimes integrated in sort of the international system? And the second is, if it's not that much, should we be thinking about kind of a Jackson Vanik 2.0? You know, I mean, should we be starting to think about, you know, throwing out some of these autocratic countries from the international system that we've integrated them into?
May?
Please.
Well, just a simple note. Most of the countries in this world under the Freedom House count are not free. They are autocratic, they are sometimes kleptocratic. That's just the reality, so let's face it, we cannot just forget about them. And I assure you, some judgments from Soviet Union were enforced in the United States historically. It happened. They are not political then. If it's family issues, it has to be enforced.
Yeah, what you're mentioning is a big dilemma. And as it is now, we are seeing that the world is being divided. There's less and less financial interaction between countries. FATCA, the US law on foreign tax accounts, is a big hindrance. So all US residents are being sacked by European banks. So you cannot open a bank account in a European bank that has any international contact. So for example, in France, Americans can only open bank accounts with small local banks or with a post bank, not with any of the big banks because it's too complicated. Similar with countries when it comes to correspondent banking accounts. About half of the countries in the world are not allowed to have correspondent banking in dollars. And this is a big concern that the IMF is trying to push for, because it means that most of sub-Saharan Africa has no banking contacts in dollars. Most of the Caribbean and most of the former Soviet republics. I think that there are only 4 or 5 that have a correspondent banking in dollars now. And if you live in a country that is a kleptocracy, then you are unfortunately treated as a kleptocrat by foreign authorities. And this is very much what this is about, that this should not be the case. Decent people in indecent countries should be considered as being decent.
Yes, sir.
Rich Koslerich from George Mason University. I understand the focus on Russia, but what about countries like Azerbaijan, for example, who ought to be also on the hit list, shall we say, of kleptocracies that we should be applying these principles to?
Completely agree.
Yeah, I think Azerbaijan, as Rich knows well, is an excellent example of what a relatively small scale, population-wise, geographic-wise, kleptocracy, how it can punch above its weight internationally. Now, obviously, Azerbaijan's role in energy infrastructure, especially in Europe, is, it allows it a certain extra measure of attention from international audiences. But what Azerbaijan has been able to do, and I wish I would know what kind of effect it had on other kleptocracies mirroring it, but it set such an example of effective corruption of international governing bodies, organizations, universities, think tanks. I mean, Atlantic Council took money from SOCAR, right? My own university, Columbia, has been embroiled in issues of taking money from Azerbaijan. Harvard has as well, in order to further its own message, in order to deepen the pockets of its own first family, and in order to massage its image for international audiences. I think it's an excellent example, and I would certainly endorse Anders' thoughts that he would endorse such a thought of including it alongside countries like Russia, Kazakhstan, and so forth, as something that would consider and merit inclusion in whatever comes next.
Yes.
Hi, thank you. My name is Caroline Lupatini, and I'm an incoming master's student at Johns Hopkins SAIS, but this summer with the Library of Congress. And I'm actually wondering about, within the EU itself, we've discussed a little bit about the proliferation of the Magnitsky Act abroad, and also with these anti-money laundering acts. And I'm wondering if there's any resistance from some of the more right-leaning Russia-sympathetic governments in the EU, for example, Hungary, Poland, and even arguably Italy, which has been in the past quite sympathetic to Russia, in stopping or preventing these acts from going into law, or are there any Russian information or disinformation campaigns in these countries to prevent these laws from being passed? Thanks.
Yes. I'll give you one perhaps surprising observation. The only EU country that has frozen substantial amounts of assets on the basis of Ukraine-related sanctions against Putin's friends is Italy. Italy has actually quite an open registry of housing. So Arkady Rotenberg had villas for $36 million frozen in Italy, and this provoked Putin to adopt what has been called Lex Rotenberg, that poor people like Rotenberg should be given a compensation by the state when they are maltreated by foreign states because of their patriotic deeds. While in Germany, it has been recently revealed that Arkady Rotenberg happens to have $1 billion of real estate in Hamburg, Berlin, Munich, and Frankfurt. And the German authorities have failed so far to freeze this, which is then, in the typical Russian fashion, in layers of 20 to 30 shell companies. And I think that this will happen, but the burden of proof to find out about the eventual owner is tough. And when it comes to the political process of the Magnitsky Act, it's very much Bill Browder who's pursuing that campaign, and he's doing it splendidly, but it's typical that it was the 3 Baltic countries that adopted it first, and very surprisingly that Gibraltar did so. So I think that we will see one country after the other adopted. I would expect that Sweden and Denmark do so pretty soon. But this is a process that drives control of dirty money. And you can say that in many ways the Magnitsky Act has turned out to be much more successful than others, because it pinpoints specific people, and it means that their assets should be frozen, and of course it also blocks visas.
Thank you. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is David Troy. I do social media network analytics. I had a question about the attacks that we've seen this week on Mr. McFaul and Mr. Browder. I feel like these sorts of attacks on private citizens probably won't end there. How grave do you think that the threat is to other U.S. citizens, including journalists and other members of civil society at present and into the future? The President has made it clear that he will stand by a foreign adversary as he takes turns attacking U.S. citizens.
Well, if I may, again, I've already raised this point, just to make it clear. I mean, anyone, including U.S. citizens, especially private citizens, not the official, can be interrogated here by the request of Russian Federation. I mean, this is the obligation of the United States under the bilateral treaty with Russian Federation. The question, I mean, actually, again, I myself, within my UCAS case, volunteered to be interrogated by Russians. We motioned, I mean, for my lawyers, we motioned the investigation to do that, and they rejected. They didn't want to. So let's separate like the legal options, which definitely existent and can be implemented, and the whole political story created by Putin for his own means by telling Mr. Trump, well, let us interrogate some people in the US. Legally, in the criminal cases, they don't need it. They don't need to interrogate those people whom they already convicted, like Bill Browder. So it's just a political game.
Well, I would say that by singling out these specific individuals, I think that Putin tried to offer the incentives to U.S. civil servants not to do their job, not to stick out their neck, to be cautious. So I think that this is very, very bad and should be beaten down very sharply.
And I think, just to the question, I think it's indicative once more of the role that the Magnitsky Act itself as a piece of legislation, and then beyond that, the Global Magnitsky Act and the precedent that that can and has continued to set, the role that that has played in being such a frustrating and, in a certain sense, embarrassing aspect for Putin himself and his role as racketeer and controlling the turf, so on and so on. The role that that has played, I think that his singling out of Mr. Browder, his singling out of Kyle Parker, or the Kremlin singling out of Kyle Parker, much in the same way that we saw, I guess, in the June 2016 meeting at Trump Tower with Natalia Veselnitskaya and Mr. Manafort and Trump Jr., obviously nominally about adoptions, really about lifting the sanctions, the Magnitsky Act. I think it is just, it's yet another marker of the role and frustrating aspect that legislation specifically has played for the Putin regime, and I think it's indicative of what types of tools can and should be used and expanded moving forward.
Let me add here actually a point. And the result of Irina Borogina in their book, The Red Web, the latest edition of it, they show that when the Panama Papers came out on the 3rd of April 2016, immediately after that, Dmitry Peskov, Putin's press secretary, and then a few days later, Putin himself went on a sharp attack about this. Putin looked, according to them, upon the Panama Papers as directed against him. And it's in the Panama Papers that we can read this, that $800,000 went to Roldugin, Putin's cellist friend. So, the deduction here is that this is when Putin decided, which also fits with the indictment last week, to go for this big hacking attack. They were prepared, But this is when we really decided to go in a big way for it. And it's also interesting in the Steele dossier, which I think is very credible, that on the 8th of August, Sergei Ivanov, then Chief of Staff of Putin, says that Peskov had argued in favor of hard hacking in the US, and Sergei Ivanov thought that it was too daring and that it would backfire on Russia, and therefore he had been against it, but he had lost out in relation to Peskov. And 2 days later, Sergei Ivanov was sacked. So I think that we should use the Steele dossier much more as heavy evidence of what was happening.
Right. Yes.
Me again, Kristen, Caspian Policy Center. So going back to money laundering, taking into consideration the recent Russian, the 12 indictments we just had, as well as maybe almost unironically in the past 48 hours, Russia has upped their regulations for cryptocurrency miners. How exactly does the U.S., since it seems right now we're so far behind on cryptocurrency policy and we're just now catching up, how should the U.S.'s approach right now be in counting cryptocurrency laundering?
Yeah, it's basically rather easy. One is somebody should register who is the actual owner, the beneficiary owner of all enterprises. And we have in particular 4 states that Casey mentioned that are not interested in doing it, Delaware being the all-dominant. The State Secretary of Delaware has recently found this so embarrassing so that he supported this legislation that has not been as yet adopted. If this legislation goes through, the registration would lie with FinCEN in Treasury, so that the states will not have all of that work, because it's actually quite a substantial work, because it's not only to register, but people should have the possibility of checking it. That's where the work lies. So that's the first part. The second part is that real estate was excluded after half a year in the Patriot Act, which came into force in 2001. Real estate is not subject to any control of money laundering. And the Treasury assessment of how much money is laundered into real estate is $100 billion a year. And this is then mainly in New York and Miami, Palm Beach, southern Florida. And half of the real estate in Miami is bought for cash, which tells you how that is being done. And then most countries have rules against large cash payments, say $10,000. If you have more than $10,000 in payment, then it should go through a bank or a financial institution. And then the fourth thing is the law firms. Law firms can take in money in unlimited amount without any control under client-attorney privilege. And this is something that is unheard of in the rest of the world. This is a peculiar thing because the law firms are so strong in the United States. This should simply not happen. So if you just do these 4 things, the situation is perfectly clear. So technically it's not difficult. And with regard to the Patriot Act, you can see that when the Patriot Act came into force, all the problems with shell banks, etc., were resolved within a few years. US law is effective when it exists and is applied. But if it's not applied, as with regard to FARA, then it's not effective.
Casey, you look like you have something to add.
Sure. Well, just to build off of Anders' point, and Kristen, I don't know if this is getting to the cryptocurrency question per se, but I think it's worth highlighting that obviously one of the best outcomes or aspects of the Patriot Act itself was all of these new regulations pertaining to financial transparency. The real estate aspect of it was provided a temporary exemption. The Patriot Act was passed in what, October 2001, thereabouts. It's been 17 years. That temporary exemption is still a temporary exemption. It's been continued and extended every single year. Now, that said, and I know we were talking about this earlier, the Department of Treasury in 2016 was sufficiently concerned about the $100 billion that had been laundered in the American real estate industry that it, and some of you may be aware of this, began a pilot program called Geographic Targeting Orders, GTOs, that targeted a handful, I think it was about a half dozen locales here in the U.S., Manhattan, Miami, Palm Beach, San Antonio, San Diego. I think the Bay Area was included in there, that if a purchase was made at a certain threshold, say $1 million, $2 million, it could not be made anonymously. It could not be made through an anonymous shell company. It could not be made without identifying who the beneficial owner, who the ultimate owner of that title to that property actually is. It's since been extended to Honolulu. Wouldn't you know it, this has been one of the most effective anti-money laundering policies Department of Treasury has implemented over the past couple years. There was a recent paper that came out last month from a Florida and a New York-based research team that found that of all of these types of purchases that prior had been conducted perfectly anonymously, over the past 2 years, that's seen a 70% drop. I mean, it's a massive drop. Yeah. We've had multiple percentage points come off not only total purchases, but actual price purchases themselves, or price points themselves, driving down the prices themselves, would seem to indicate that this specific program at least is preventing those types of purchases that we'd seen. Now, we don't know if it's presenting kleptocratic monies wholesale. It could be rerouted into places like Dallas or Cheyenne, Wyoming, for that matter, right now, that aren't covered by these GTOs. But there's every indication, there's every reason to argue for the expansion of and permanency of these GTOs.
Excellent. Sir, I see you had a question. Oh, did you have a question as well? Perfect.
Ilya Levin, formerly of the Department of State, retired Foreign Service officer. I want to follow up on something that Pavel Ivlev said earlier. If I understand you correctly, according to the Bilateral Legal Assistance Treaty, Russian representatives can come here and question a U.S. citizen. My question is this: would there be any legal consequences for someone, say, like Ambassador McFall or anyone else, if he simply refused to take part in this exercise?
Sure. It's not that simple. So the Russian interrogator come here and question. He may, first of all, come up with a list of questions and ask the American colleagues to ask this question to someone. And with their permission, the interrogator can be present at this question, but he cannot put the question himself. That's the general rule and how it is applied. And of course, if Ambassador McFall or anyone else simply says, no, I don't answer this question, that's it. That's the end of the story. There's no repercussions, no liability for not answering.
Yes, right in the back. Oh, do we have one more?
Hi, my name is Jamie Ehrlich. I'm with CNN. I am asking about, on Monday, Vladimir Putin at the summit said that he didn't have time to keep track of the 500 businessmen that were in Moscow when they visited, when he was asked about the compromising information about President Trump. I'm wondering if it is within Moscow's playbook to be keeping track of 500 American businessmen who are within Moscow for a business conference.
This I can easily answer. As a former Swedish diplomat in Moscow from 84 to 87, they have enormous capacity to keep track of any foreigner of any relevance. It would be very amazing if a person like Donald Trump, a purported US billionaire, is not filmed virtually all the time. When I was at the Swedish embassy, this is in 86, we found microphones throughout the embassy that were in the steel reinforcement of the embassy and had been there since the embassy had been built. I once had a dinner at home, this is in June '87, with we were 8 people. The dinner started at 7 o'clock and went on until 2:30. We were in 3 different rooms, spoke 3 different languages. The next day, 3 of my guests were called for interrogation in the afternoon with full transcripts of the full conversation and asked questions like, why did you say so and so at 11:49? And 3 of them were expelled. And this is under Gorbachev's nice glasnost and perestroika, and the resources now are far greater. The technology is much greater. So you can take for granted that there would have been a film of Trump all the time wherever he went.
Thank you.
You have
we have time for one more. Yes, sir, right in the back.
Jonathan Reich from GMR. Thank you for all of the wonderful policy recommendations that you and Mr. Browder made today. I think what we heard a lot of were defensive strategies, with the exception of sanctions for protecting, fortifying U.S. institutions, and maybe better protecting some of the victims and targets of Russian interference and abuse of our democratic institutions here in the U.S. and in Europe as well. I'm curious whether, in thinking about shifting some of the ways that our judiciary thinks about Russian interference or Russian attempts to leverage our judiciary system and our democratic institutions, whether it's also time to rethink some of the aspects of foreign sovereign immunity that we extend broadly to all nations throughout the world, which largely protects them from any sort of parity or symmetry in the ability of victims or targets to use the same court systems to then respond or go after the regimes such as Putin's Kremlin, which may be targeting them.
Probably for you, it's a very judicial question.
Right, but well, it struck me a little bit. I mean, to use the legal system. You mean for U.S. government to use Russian legal system the same way as Russian Federation is using our legal system? Well, that's probably nonsense, because the Russian legal system is illegal by itself. It's a lawless country, so it's a way nowhere to just for us to attempt to use it. But on the other hand, you also raised the issue of the immunity of, say, Russian assets here if they belong to the Russian Federation and things like this. And it's really an important point for me, for example, as a former part of UCAS team, because we had the International Arbitration Award for $50 billion, and we were trying to enforce it around the globe against the Russian Federation assets. And it's not that easy. I mean, it's now on hold because of the Dutch decision, but still, in future, it's hopefully to be possible. And still, we will face that issue of sovereign immunity of various assets of Russian Federation. But on the other side of that, if we insist that the sovereign immunity has to be removed, that will be against our national interest, because the same moment we do it here, the protection is removed from various United States assets in, say, Russia. So we need to act carefully, at least in this. And U.S. government normally rejects these options, thinking about the protection of the national interests.
Let me take the purely economic side of it. Central bank reserves are typically given full sovereignty, not necessarily for a country like Iran, but with regard to Russia, central bank reserves have been clearly outside of the scope of financial sanctions from July 2014. The Russians did not think so. Russia has essentially withdrawn the reserves that they held with the New York Federal Reserve. It was a big amount of money, something like $100 billion, and they removed that money during the time of the annexation of Crimea. A few days ago, Russia sold most of their US treasuries, so that they were afraid that something would happen there. I can't imagine what it was. But, and of course there has been a discussion of taking Russia off SWIFT. But so far nothing has happened to that, and there is a big reason for that, namely that Russia has total external debts. This is corporate debt, both public companies and private companies, of about $500 billion. What Russia could do if it was taken off the SWIFT and if the central bank reserves were sanctioned, Russia could default on its external debt, and people in the Treasury are afraid that that would be a new Lehman Brothers collapse with freezing of global liquidity. So there are possibilities, but I think that the US government would be very careful in touching upon it.
Do we have any further questions?
Time is up.
Okay, well, thank you very much for an engaging discussion. Bringing, shining a light on this issue is progress. We'll see if we can continue to make progress towards kleptocracy, but thank you very, very much.
Thank you.